Cascade Ridge, Oregon Territory, winter of 1878. 9 winters had come and gone since Elias Mercer last heard another soul speak his name. The forest didn't call him by words. It spoke in groans, in wind, in the distant creak of pine bones swaying under snow. It whispered in the hush of falling branches and the soft hiss of water freezing midstream. That was the only language he needed. They called him the ghost of Cascade Ridge, though no one had seen him long enough to say what he truly looked like anymore. Folks in Rosehill remembered a younger man once, tall, broad, with a chest full of fire and arms stronger than oxen. But time had carved hollows into him like a blade through driftwood. Now, he moved like a shadow through the trees, seen, perhaps, but never truly known. He spoke to no one, not because he couldn't, but because there was no one left worth the words. Each year, when the frost bit into the land and the first snow blanketed the earth, Elias descended from his cabin high in the ridge. He would appear near midnight on the steps of Rosehill's church, leaving behind a single object, a handcrafted rocking chair, smooth as river stone, made of pine and birch, always with the same detail etched into its backrest, a single sparrow in flight. Then he'd vanish again before the sun dared rise. People guessed. They always guessed. Some said he carved the chairs for a lost child. Others believed they were offerings for a dead wife. One woman swore she'd seen him sobbing behind the chapel window before disappearing into the snow, but nobody believed her. Most thought Elias Mercer had simply gone mad up there, alone with the trees. But he hadn't gone mad. He remembered. He remembered everything. Her face. Her laughter. Her hands calloused from canning fruit and stitching socks. The way she called his name when he came in from the timber line, beard frozen, hands raw from the blade. Her name was Clara, and the world lost color when she vanished. The world turned gray. That November, the cold came early. Bitter wind howled through the canyons. Snow fell in sheets, blanketing the ridge before the mountain even had time to groan beneath its weight. Elias split wood faster, hoarded venison deeper, nailed shut the gaps in the cabin walls he'd ignored in previous years. Something was wrong. The cold wasn't just cold, it was warning. On the night of that cursed month, something snapped in the woods. Not a twig. Not a branch. Something else. It was sharp. Sudden. Final. A rope. Elias rose from his bedroll, rifle in hand before his mind even caught up. The forest was not quiet anymore. It was waiting. He moved through the trees with the silence of a creature born there. Snow sank beneath his boots, soft as breath. The moon hung low, peeking between clouds like an eye too afraid to open fully. And then he saw her, half buried in frost and broken branches, bound at the wrists with frayed rope, mouth bloodied from a gag, her dress torn and soaked through, her legs twisted under her like they'd been tossed carelessly from a horse. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes were alive, wide, burning with the will not to die, staring straight into his as though she'd been waiting for him all along. She didn't scream, didn't move, didn't flinch. Not a word left her lips, because she couldn't speak. She was deaf. Elias dropped to his knees, heart hammering harder than any tree he'd felled. Gently, he unwrapped the rope from her wrists, one loop at a time, watching how she winced with each tug. The claw from her mouth came last. Her breath came in shallow puffs, each one a ghost fleeing her lungs. "You can't hear me," he whispered, voice raw from disuse. "But I hear you. Loud as thunder." She blinked once. "Who left you here?" he asked, already knowing the kind of men who would. Her lips trembled. Her eyes didn't leave his. "You ain't safe. But you're not alone. Not anymore." The woman sagged into his arms then, like the woods had been holding her up until the very moment someone kind arrived. Elias swept her off the ground, lifting her like he'd once carried Clara over the threshold of their old cabin, back when the world made sense. Snow fell heavy now, thick as curtains, blinding the path ahead. He moved by memory, step after step, heart tethered to the weak rise and fall of her chest. The cabin door creaked open with the wind. He laid her by the fire, wrapped her in his only wool blanket, and stoked the flames higher. She watched him the whole time, her eyes darting, calculating, scared but sharp. Not a victim. A survivor. As he fetched water, laid strips of dried meat by her side, and began gently cleaning the dried blood on her lips, something glittered in the corner of his vision. A glint in the snow by the door. He stepped back into the storm and crouched low. Buried in the powder, half concealed by pine needles, was a brooch. Silver, cold to the touch, shaped like a sparrow mid-flight, one wing red with what wasn't rust. He froze. He'd seen that mark before. Not in the woods. Not in the town. On a wanted poster. 3 years ago, a traveling marshal had stopped by Rosehill, warning of a cult moving westward under the guise of scripture. They called themselves the Sparrow Order, saviors of the deaf, the mute, the forgotten. But the lawman said they weren't saviors. They were traders, collectors, and worse. He said if anyone ever saw the Silver Sparrow, they were already too close. Elias looked back toward the woman, who hadn't moved, her breath fogging the air like a rhythm, steady and light. The brooch gleamed at his palm. Something had followed her here, or something had left her behind, on purpose. By morning, the snow outside had risen past the cabin's lowest log, muffling the world into stillness. Inside, the only sound was the quiet scratch of metal on wood. Elias stirred from the hearth and turned toward the table, where the woman, wrapped in his old wool coat, clutched the handle of a carving knife. She wasn't afraid. Her fingers were steady, her jaw clenched in quiet resolve. He stepped closer and saw the name she'd etched into the pine tabletop, one letter at a time. Clara. She looked up at him, face expressionless, then tapped the name twice with her finger and pointed to herself. Clara. Elias nodded once, slow and certain. Her name curled inside his chest like he'd finally seeping into frozen wood. He pointed to himself and mouthed, Elias. Her lips formed a shape back silently. Elias. There was no need for more words that day. She wasn't one for fear or chatter. But she watched everything, his hands, his footsteps, the rhythm of his breath when he spoke. She read him like forest signs in deep snow. When she couldn't follow his voice, she followed his eyes. That evening, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside the fire, chewing dried meat with measured, mechanical bites. Elias laid a wool blanket over her shoulders, then took the brooch from the mantel. The Silver Sparrow still bore its crimson stain. He held it out. She stared. Her face didn't change, but her hands did. They curled into fists. She reached for a scrap of paper near the hearth, dipped the end of a burnt log into the flame, and wrote in jagged charcoal strokes. He wore it. Always. Elias nodded. Who was he? She paused. Then wrote, a preacher. But not God's. Her expression darkened. She pressed her hand to her collarbone and then drew across through the air with 2 fingers, once vertical, once horizontal, then twisted her hand as if breaking something. The message was clear. I buried him. Elias asked gently. She shook her head. I did. He didn't press further. But that night, when she drifted into uneasy sleep, twitching under layers of pelts, Elias stepped outside and dropped the brooch into the fire pit behind the cabin. It flared blue as it melted, and the smell of scorched metal drifted into the trees. The next day, Clara started drawing. Not on paper, but on the frost-lace windows. With her fingertip, she traced circles. Some intersected like overlapping eyes. Others bore tiny dots inside, like pupils. Then came a sparrow with bent wings, bound in lines she marked with excess. Elias didn't ask. He just watched. On the 3rd night, she pressed a folded note into his palm. Her handwriting was rough, but clear. There's more than one. They know I'm alive. He folded the paper slowly. His hands didn't shake, but his knuckles turned white. Elias walked to the corner of the cabin and lifted the loose floorboard. Beneath it, wrapped in canvas and time, was the axe he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. It had once felled redwoods and broken ribs. He unwrapped it, ran his fingers along its dulled edge, and set to sharpening. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in the coat again, barefoot on the floorboards. She stepped forward, trembling but steady, and placed her hand over his. She nodded once. That night, they spoke with gestures and silence. Elias mapped the forest on the table with lines drawn in ash. Clara nodded, pointed, corrected. She traced a pattern from the trees to the creek, to the trail, to a ridge just above the cabin, then marked a circle and tapped it 3 times. Watch here. Elias tapped the table in return. I will. They trapped the woods as best they could. Elias hung tin scraps and iron shards in the trees, makeshift chimes to warn of footsteps. Clara scattered broken glass beneath snow near the trail. She knew how to move without a sound, and how to hear what others missed. And still, the signs came. Once, a feather drifted from the roof, blackened at the tip. Another time, a bundle of sage was tied to the cabin's back door with red twine. And one morning, she woke with a sparrow carved into the outer wall, just above the window where she slept. Elias grew more watchful, more silent. He checked the traps 3 times a day, never the same path twice. His axe never left his side, even when he gathered water. Clara began practicing with a blade. She'd move through the snow, slow at first, then with eerie precision, cutting targets from bark, slashing rope bundles into strands. And though no voice passed between them, a bond had formed. When Elias rose, Clara was already at the hearth. When he needed wood, she'd left it stacked by the door. In the evenings, she carved bird from scrap pine. Sparrows, falcons, crows. Then she'd toss them into the fire, watching each one blacken and curl. Her silence wasn't hollow. It was forged. Late one night, as the snow fell gentle and slow, Clara curled on the cot while Elias sat beside her. She couldn't hear the wind, but she felt the way it shifted the firelight. She turned to him, eyes half-lidded, her body wrapped in warmth. He brushed a lock of hair from her brow. "I don't know your voice, Clara," he whispered, barely audible over the flame, "but I know your silence, and it speaks of fire." She closed her eyes. Her hand found his, fingers curling over knuckles cracked from labor and frost. He spoke again, softer still. "Let them come," he muttered. "Let them try to take what's mine again." Clara's lips parted in a small, breathless smile. "You weren't lost," he said, his voice now almost reverent. "You were hidden, like something precious." The cabin went still. Only the crackle of wood and the slow rhythm of her breath remained. They slept without dreams. By morning, Elias stepped out with a bucket and felt the change. It wasn't the temperature, it was the air itself. Tense. Too quiet. He moved to the eastern tree line, eyes narrowed. There, 50 feet from the cabin, planted straight in the snow, was a wooden cross. Rough-hewn. Freshly carved. Smoke curled from its base like incense. Tied to it, wings limp, was a sparrow. Still warm. Its neck was broken clean. Elias froze. Then he turned his gaze to the trees behind it. Carved into the bark, bold and deep, were 4 words. "Return her or burn." The cross stood like a dare in the snow, the sparrow limp against it, its broken neck swinging in the wind. Elias stared at the carving in the bark behind it, asterisk return her or burn asterisk, and knew what had to be done. He went to work. The forest became a trap. He laced the brush with snares, shallow pits covered with frostbitten leaves, and thin cords pulled tight to trip a man at the knee. He carved decoys from firewood, figures shaped like Clara, wrapped in spare dresses, tied with black ribbon at the waist. He set them by the creek where the ice was thin, their faces hidden beneath scarves. He coated the edge of his axe with boar fat so it would slice quicker through flesh and not stick on bone. And Clara moved through the woods like she'd been born of them. She found her old chains buried beneath the cabin floor, the same chains she'd worn when Elias first found her half-dead in the snow. She didn't burn them. She hung them from the trees. Like wind chimes. Like warnings. One by one, they clinked in the cold, a soft metallic whisper every time the wind shifted, sharp enough to catch a breath, to betray a footstep. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was waiting. They lit no fire that night. They didn't sleep. They stood at opposite ends of the cabin, Elias facing the east trail, Clara the rear ridge. Moonlight bled through the treetops, silver and slow, turning every shadow into a blade. And then, they came. First, a smell, like oil and wet parchment. Then movement, a ripple of black through the trees, slow and deliberate, as if the forest itself was sick. 3 men stepped from the darkness, cloaked, barefoot, whispering words not meant for the living. One dragged a crooked staff carved with spirals. Another carried a burlap sack, its bottom stained dark. The third held a crucifix nailed to a broken sled, its arm smeared in red ochre. They moved in a circle, closing like wolves. Clara crouched behind a tree, breath slow and steady. Her fingers trembled, but her grip didn't. She held a branch whittled to a spike, sharpened against the cabin wall hours earlier. Her eyes found Elias through the dark. He nodded once. Then he vanished into the trees. The first man stepped too close to the wrong snowdrift. The pit opened beneath him, swallowing him thigh-deep with a crack. He screamed. It was the last sound he made. The axe came from nowhere, slicing into the soft of his leg. He dropped, screaming again, but shorter this time, before a second blow ended him. The second man rushed toward the sound, dragging his sack like a broken limb. He never saw Clara. She rose behind him, silent as a ghost. The branch plunged into his throat in one quick motion. His hands clawed the air, then fell. Blood soaked the snow in a strange, circular pattern. She didn't flinch. But the third man, he wasn't fooled. He watched them from beyond the clearing. Tall. Robed. His mouth stitched shut with black thread. His fingers boring markings, symbols Elias couldn't read but recognized as poison. He didn't rush. He simply raised a crooked staff and pointed it straight at Clara. Elias emerged between them, rifle raised. The man tilted his head, his stitched lips curling upward, somehow smiling without moving. "She belongs to the silence," he said, voice dry as paper, as if the stitches weren't real. Elias stepped forward, rifle unwavering. "No." He pulled the hammer back. "She belongs to herself." One shot cracked through the trees like lightning. The robeman jerked back but didn't fall. He staggered forward, blood soaking his robe, mouth twitching like a puppet. Another shot. This one found his heart. He collapsed into the snow, eyes wide, mouth torn where the stitches had split. The forest was silent again, except for the chains, still swaying in the trees, singing softly in the wind. By morning, the red on the snow had frozen black. Elias and Clara worked in silence. They burned the staff. It took hours to catch, but once it did, it hissed like a snake being killed. Elias scattered the ash into the stream, then tossed a broken crucifix into the fire pit where the brooch had melted. Clara gathered the sack. Inside were cloth bindings, a blindfold, a cracked silver bowl, and a single hair ribbon, powder blue, like a sky that hadn't been seen in months. She tied it into her hair. She never said why. Winter loosened its grip, week by week. The ice along the ridge melted first, revealing stones and moss that had been hidden beneath 9 seasons of silence. Elias built a small workshop beside the cabin, a one-room shed with a wide window and a table made of cedar. Clara filled it with birds. She carved them from pine, one after another, sparrows, jays, owls, finches. Some in flight, wings spread. Some in cages, their eyes wide. But most had their beaks wide open, unchained. When spring came, Clara smiled. It wasn't wide. It didn't flash. It was small, careful, and real. Like something rediscovered, not new. She planted lavender near the porch. Elias carved her name into the doorframe with the same knife she'd used to mark his table. They moved like two people no longer haunted, but still aware that ghosts watched from behind the trees. People in Rosehill spoke again of the man in the woods. Said the ghost had returned. But now, they said, he wasn't alone. They said he had a wife. He didn't correct them. That November, the townsfolk waited, half expecting another rocking chair to appear on the church steps. But when the sun rose, they found something else. A wooden sparrow, carved with perfect detail, wings stretched wide, mouth open, not silent, not tamed. Beside it sat a note, written in a careful, unsteady hand. Asterisk, she's not lost. She's free, asterisk. Clara watched from the ridge as the snow began to fall again. She stood on the porch, hair ribbon fluttering, hands wrapped in wool. Elias stepped beside her, handing her a mug of tea gone cold. She mouthed the words slowly, clearly, so he could see. You heard me when no one else did. He looked down at her hand, curled into his. And you, he said, voice cracking from a place deeper than memory, you gave my silence back a name. The wind moved through the trees then, but it didn't howl. It sang.